Hello and welcome, I'm Kayla Scrivener, and today I'm doing the Reading Rush Tag and TBR. I'm going to jump right in because I am a day late, and the first one is to read a book that has a house on the cover. For this, I'm going to read We've Always Lived in a Castle by Shirley Jackson. For the longest time, I said I was never going to read horror, and then I started dipping my toe into classic horror, and one of the big ones for me was The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I really love the way that she uses horror to talk about themes and thematics and psychology of the person, and she does a really good job of We've Always Lived in the Castle. I've read majority of it already, about 4 hours into the 6-hour audiobook, and it is kind of eerie and creepy, not as like scary, but I really enjoyed the psychological thing of it. And she's really obsessed with thinking of moons and gardens, and killing people. So this is an interesting, I have no idea how it's going to turn out. The second question is to read a book in the same room, which kind of, I do it all the time, but I'm going to pick a short book for this because it is definitely easier, so I'm not wandering around the house or something like that. So for this, I'm going to be reading The Last Lecture by Randy Posh. This is a book that focuses on Randy, and it's a memoir of his life when he finds out that he has cancer and he is no longer going to be able to be a professor because he's going to be dead. That's kind of dark, but it's the truth, and he decides, looking over what he wants to say, is his last lecture to his students before his death. Question number 3 is to read a book set in a place you want to visit. And for this is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is set in a big old English manor set in the middle of the UK, and I really want to read this. I want to go into a sprawling place with lots of hidden corridors and creepy rooms and hopefully not actually haunted, but I'm not sure exactly what this book is because it's classic mystery, so a lot of people don't give specific things about it. This, I know, is set about an unnamed protagonist who marries a rich older man who is widowed, and she becomes obsessed with his late wife named Rebecca. And I am about 1/4 through this book and I still don't know everything. Every sentence is written with such double meaning, written brilliantly and yet eerily and beautifully at the same time. I don't know, I can't wait to finish this book, and it sounds absolutely delightful. The next question is to read a book that will make you happy. And for this, I have Shakespeare sonnets, because love makes you happy, or the fact that you think about the fact that we will be still single and much older when the quarantine is over. I am about 10 into this and I'm really enjoying it. Some of it is older language, so it's a little bit harder to divine the meaning, but overall I think that is going to be absolutely lovely. So beginning the tag part of the questions, the first question is, how is your reading going during isolation? My reading has been a little bit erratic, as it kind of always is. During the first 2 weeks, I didn't really read a lot. I read about 3 books, and majority of the books that I had on audiobooks or just were planning on reading ended up just lapsing and I didn't read. And during the last 2 weeks, I read about 14 other books, and they are being delightful, but very different from what I normally read. I normally read across the board, but primarily fantasy is the largest amount of it. Mostly I've been reading contemporary historical fiction and nonfiction, and it's been wonderful. I feel like I need to feel more grounded and feel like I'm being heard in this moment of very emotional but also just unsure times, and I think that is often conveyed more through the grounded reality. The next question is, where have you been reading? Pretty much bed. Nothing has really changed. I moved at the beginning of the quarantine and I am now in a new apartment, so I've been reading slightly on the couch now. Look at me being outgoing. Question number 3. Which is the best book that you have read in isolation? For me, this has to be Becoming by Michelle Obama. I didn't think I was going to read it for the longest time because I'm Canadian. I don't know that much about her other than her name, but I heard it was wonderful, so I gave it a try and I was blown away. I felt myself choke crying a lot of the time, just a quiet emotional ability that I just couldn't express how much it impacted me. And it follows her from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, and the experiences of being a woman that are unique to them, as well as just the experiences of being a person of color, as well as being and living in poverty and through that. And it was incredible. Then we move on to her adulthood, her thoughts about being a career, being a mother, her experiences of miscarriage and trouble in fertility, her marriage, falling in love, and what that means is a traditional versus more modern look of love. And then as her husband goes into politics, how that affects their family, how that affects her. And even though you think it would be more a political memoir as she is married to the first Black president, instead it is more looking at her emotions and how politics and her husband living in public life and then her living in public life, how that affected her job, her relationship, and the emotions of her family. And it was incredible. I loved watching this woman go from someone no one would really think anything about to someone who changed the world. And it happened so quickly, and the humanity behind that. It was amazing. The next question is a feel-good book, and I struggle with this because I really read a lot of depressing books, but for me this one will always be Anne of the Island and Anne of Green Gables series in general. A lot of people discredit Anne of Green Gables as being this kind of childhood book that no one really cares about and it's just happy and go lucky, but it is filled with a lot of trauma and a lot of things. In the second book, it really talks about how she was so scarred for love for so long that she didn't even realize love was a thing, and this echoes Lucy Maud Montgomery's life. A lot of times she dealt with a lot of trauma, a lot of neglect, and a lot of abuse during her life, and eventually took her life by suicide, and yet she was able to give a lot of joy and emotion through that, even though her own life was so full of tragedy. And for me, I always look at Lucy Maud Montgomery and I look at Anne of Green Gables and I see a person who goes through trauma and yet is able to redeem her situation through imagination and intelligence, and through that will always be my hero and will always be able to bring me joy in the worst of times. Question number 5 is, which book do you wish you could buy or borrow during this time? This is not quite available yet, but it will be in a month, and I'm very excited for this. And this is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins, the prequel to The Hunger Games. And I have this dilemma, which I want to read it physically because I read these physically, I binged them, I'm planning on binge rereading them again, and yet we have this issue where I don't like spending a ton of money on books. And I know that this book is going to be a mammoth of a price because this series is one of the most well-known series of all time, and I don't want to do it. But I also don't want to listen to it audio. I don't even know if my book library will have it on audio, and even then I'm going to have to wait forever because it's the friggin' Hunger Games. So I'm a little bit at a dilemma for this, but I'll decide. Probably it will be in the middle of the night and it will call to me and I'll make a rash decision. Anyways, the final question on this is shout out to an author, because we all know that authors are having a hard time. Publishing as a whole is having a hard time. Indie shops are having a hard time, so support them when you can. And I want to shout out an author that I recently read for the first time, and this is Jesse Thistle. He writes Out of the Ashes, which is a memoir about his experiences of being Indigenous and Métis Canadian and how this affected his life of childhood and living in poverty, living with addiction around him and missing parents, and his experience with addiction and homelessness especially, and how he went from that to being someone who redeemed that situation by having people speak into his life and becoming a scholar and winning a ton of awards for academics and just becoming a person that turned his life away because people spoke into his life. This is a story that probably a lot of people aren't gravitating toward right now because it was one dealing with a lot of hardship, but I think that supporting people whose books that aren't as marketable because they are more niche and people don't necessarily underlook people who are in the Native community. They don't give them enough representation in our politics, in the choices that we make, as well as our literature. So I think it's an important book to read, an important book to support authors of color and authors of minorities as well. And these are the books that I'm going to be reading, the books that I want to talk about, and tell me which book gives you happiness or makes you feel heard during these times. You can find me on Twitter and you can find me on Instagram, where I post more regularly about the books that I'm reading, and I will see you soon. Happy reading and writing. Bye.